Alright everyone, what is going on? Voodoo51292, and this video is going to be basically some corrections that I am going to be making to my game review, game rating scale. And you'll remember earlier this year, in the summer I believe it was, I actually did a video called my game rating scale breakdown, and basically broke down for you the way that I rated my games. I gave you a description of each range of the scale, meaning basically 0 to 1, 1 to 2, what those different ranges really meant, the descriptions of the games that would fit within those ranges. And I gave some other information as well about how I rated games, and after doing reviews since then, kind of a lot of them, I've come to understand that the way that I had been rating games, or at least the way I had previously said I was going to be rating games, isn't really a good method, and there's some things about it that I can change, I think, to make it better. And what I want to do is go ahead and make those changes for you, because I put a big emphasis on the game reviews, obviously, and I always have wanted to do that, so I'm always looking for ways to make the reviews better, make them easier to understand for you, and make them easier to do for me. So you'll remember, if you watched that video, that I talked about the fact that when I rated games, I said that I would be rating games on a 10th scale, basically, meaning that I would give a game a rating, something 0.0, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, and so forth, all the way to 0.9. That I'd be rating games like that. And that method really isn't very good, and here's why. I found myself a lot of times when I'm rating these games, I will think in my head, say, okay, what do I want to give this game? And I'll say, well, I think it's better than an 8, but I don't think it's as good as an 8.5. Then, from there, I have to decide, okay, is it an 8.1, an 8.2, an 8.3, or an 8.4? And what in the world is the difference? What possibly could the game have that would make a difference of a 1/10 of a point? You know what I mean? What separates an 8.2 from an 8.3? You know, those kind of minute things, I don't know. You know, I wouldn't know the exact score, so I would usually just give a score, like a 0.3 or something like that, which is generally my fail-safe. And I understand that that's even more difficult for you, the viewer, to really get a grasp on, okay, how good is the game? I mean, how good really is an 8.2? I mean, you know, why is it an 8.3? When you're comparing two games together, let's say I gave one game an 8.3 and another one an 8.4, and you're comparing those two games together, thinking about which one you want to get, if they're two, say FPS games or something like that, you may be completely lost. Say, okay, this game's better by a 1/10 of a point. I mean, really, what in there is a 1/10 of a point better than the other game, you know? So, what I've decided to do is I'm going to go ahead and adopt a new number scale that actually a lot of major reviewers use. I know that DSP uses this scale in his Hateful Truth reviews. Game Informer magazine uses this game rating scale in their magazine, and I think that I'm going to go ahead and adopt it for myself. And so from now on, instead of rating games 0.1, 2, 3, 4, etc., I'm going to basically divide each range into fourths, and I will choose from 4 possible decimal points. So basically, I can give a game a something 0.0, 0.25, 0.5, or 0.75, and then obviously a 0.0 going up to the next range. So for instance, it makes it a lot easier for me to give the score and for you to understand what the score means. Going back to my previous example, if I say, okay, a game is better than an 8, but it's not quite an 8.5, whereas before I would have to decide 0.1, 0.2, what's the difference? Now it's an automatic decision. If it's better than an 8, but not an 8.5, it's an 8.25. Done. Easy. There's no picking apart minute things that distinguish one game from being a tenth of a point better than another game. No more of that. It's going to be very simple. If a game is better than an 8.5 but not quite a 9, it gets an 8.75. End of story. No 8.8s and things like that, which I have given in the past. So that's the new scale that I'm going to be adopting. You'll no longer see .3s or .7s or things like that. It's a scale that makes more sense. It's a scale that's easier to dole out scores from my end, and it's a scale that's easier for you to understand. And then if you're looking at those two FPS games, you see one game's an 8.25, one game's an 8.5. That's a lot easier in your mind to distinguish. Say, okay, well, he thinks this game is slightly better than an 8. It's not that much better than an 8, but it's slightly better. Whereas this game, okay, it's an 8.5. He thinks it's getting past an 8. It's a half a point to a 9. This one's obviously the better one, not by a lot, but it is the better one. And it's easier for you to look at those two scores and make that determination. So that's what the new scale will look like. And then one more adjustment I need to make. Previously in the last video, I stated that if I thought a game was a perfect embodiment of a range, say the range between 7 to 8, the 7 range. If I thought a game was a perfect game to fit in the 7 range, I would give it a 7.5, and then what I would do was, depending on whether or not the game was closer to being dropped down to a 6, or whether the game was closer to being bumped up to an 8, I would adjust the decimal system. So, if I thought a game was a perfect embodiment of what a 7 should be, I'd give it a 7.5. If I thought that the game was closer to being in the 6s, I'd give it, say, a 7.3. If I thought it was closer to being bumped up to an 8, I'd give it a 7.8 or something like that. Well, first of all, when I say that, it doesn't make any sense. If a game is a perfect 7, then it should be rated as a 7, not a 7.5. And what that actually does is, the previous way, it actually is score inflation. That's exactly what score inflation is. Giving games points that it doesn't deserve. And that's exactly what I want to avoid in my game reviews, is inflating the scores of games. So if I think a game is a perfect 7, it shouldn't get a 7.5, it should get a 7. And anything higher than a 7, like a 7.5, should be how much better it is than a 7. So, whereas I said in my previous video that a 7.5 was the perfect embodiment of a 7, with the new scale, a 7.5 is going to be, okay, it's a half a point better than a 7. It's a half a point towards an 8. There's not going to be score adjustment. There's not going to be any kind of score inflation. It's going to be what it is. If a game is a perfect 7, then it gets a 7, a 7.0. If it's better than a 7, it'll get higher than a 7, such as a 7.5. And just a note to make here, because then everybody might say, okay, well then every review you've done before today, the scores must be invalid because you used the old way. And in reality, that's not actually true, because I realized very quickly after I had made that video that that really wasn't a good way to rate games. And in fact, I basically have been rating games based on that new line of thinking where if I think a game is better than a 7, it gets a 7.5. I don't think I ever actually rated a game a 7.5 that I thought was a 7. I don't think I've ever done that, because I realized that it doesn't make any sense, and I think I realized that pretty quickly. It's just taken me all the way till now to actually decide, hey, it's time to actually make these changes official and let everyone know in a video. But I don't want anybody to think that all my previous scores were wrong or inflated, because it's not the case. I stand behind every single one of my scores. In fact, I went back and revised a couple of the scores that I made on a couple games earlier in the year, Crisis 2 and Brink. I thought I gypped those games out of points. I went back and revised the scores, gave them higher scores. So all of my scores I stand behind, and you should trust in those scores, because like I said, they were done basically with this style of thinking that I have now anyway. And so those scores are still valid, but those scores are obviously rated, like I said, on the 10th scale, and you will see .3s, you'll see .8s and things like that, and that is now going out the window, okay? So that's the changes, the revises I'm making to the game rating scale. I think that they're good changes. I think that they're positive. It makes things way easier, and it makes more sense. So just to review, the changes. The first change is the actual numerical number will no longer be 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, etc. It's going to be limited to a 0.0, a 0.25, 0.5, and 0.75, and that's it. And that way it's just so much easier to assign scores and so forth. And also, when I give a game a 0.5, it doesn't mean that that game is the perfect embodiment of that range. It actually means that it's a half a point better than what the range actually is. It's a half a point higher than, say, a 7, instead of imperfect embodiment of a 7. One thing I do want to say is the description of the ranges from the very first video remains the same. Those descriptions are the same. So if you go back and watch that first video, when you hear my descriptions of what each range truly means, that is still accurate, okay? So this game rating scale goes into effect today. Today is Wednesday, December 21st of 2011, and I'm actually doing a game review directly after this video. It's Assassin's Creed Revelations, and this new rating scale will be in effect for that review and every review after. So every review from December the 21st of 2011 onwards will be applied to this new rating scale. Everything before December 21st of 2011 was under the pretenses of the old scale, okay? So, thanks guys for watching. I hope that you continue to watch my game reviews, and I hope that I can continue to improve them and make them better for you, and so that you have a good, reliable source to come to for game reviews, instead of the overblown media who don't know what they're talking about when they review games, and overinflate them or undershoot them from what their real scores should be, okay? So thanks guys, and I will see you in the future with game reviews.